Perfect. So hello, everybody. Thank you for joining our first talk in March. Here we have Henry Krahn. He is going to give a talk today. Just a little bit about Henry. He is a graduate student at the Department of Philosophy, and he completed his undergraduate studies at McMaster University. And he did his masterworks in philosophy at the University of Toronto. He is primarily interested in political and legal philosophy. Outside of philosophy, Henry enjoys writing fiction and bouldering. Henry, is there anything else you would like to add to your introduction before we get started?
No, I don't think anything else needs to be added to that.
Okay. I am just going to pin your face for this talk, and if you want to go ahead and get started, that would be great.
Okay, great. Let me just start a timer so I make sure I'm not going too long. Okay. So hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. I want to start by thanking the APS and Jayla as well for their kind invitation. I think this is a really cool way to get graduate students and undergraduate students talking, and I'm excited to be able to share some of the stuff that I've been working on with you all. So I'm hoping this will be a productive, engaging session for all of us, and a good opportunity for some cross-campus philosophical interchange. So I'm looking forward to our conversation after the talk. Okay. So the title of the paper that I'm here to talk about today is Protest, Persuasion, and Coercion. But I think I could very well summarize the main thrust of the argument with the slogan, forceful protest is not always undemocratic. In this paper, I build on an earlier chapter of my dissertation where I open up the conceptual space for this claim. The idea there is to consider a strand of objections that have been raised to protest tactics such as vandalism, blockades, and occupations, and show that even on their own terms, such objections only reject these tactics insofar as they're used in service of certain aims. Here, I try to make that idea a bit more concrete by arguing for a form of protest which avoids the objection altogether. My aim then is to argue that if we interpret some kinds of protest in a particular way, that is, as a form of holding others accountable, then it avoids the objection that forceful protest is undemocratic. To get to that conclusion, I'm going to make an argument that has three parts, and I've tried to outline those parts on the handout, so hopefully we can all follow along. In the first part, I'm going to try to distinguish a particular form of holding others accountable from two other candidates that are often kind of bandied about, and that form that I'm going to try to make out is called reproof. Second, I'm going to try to show how reproof avoids an objection that some forms of holding others accountable are incompatible with the basic terms of moral intercourse. And third, I'm going to try to argue that the latter objection is analogous to the objection that forceful protest is undemocratic. Thus, I'm going to try to conclude that interpreting forceful protest as a form of reproof allows us to frame an analogous response. Okay, so before I start, let me just note two quick qualifications for what I'm about to argue here. First, although the upshot of this argument is justificatory, that is, I'm trying to say something about when forceful protest is justified, the argument itself proceeds on descriptive grounds. That is, I aim to argue that a certain way of rejecting the justification of forceful protest is only partially successful because the arguments made to this end ignore some potential kinds of forceful protest. As a result, I'm going to have little to say about other justificatory questions. I'm not trying to say here that forceful protest can be justified, all things considered, only that a common objection that it faces fails. Second, of course, this is not an attempt to give a description of what all forceful protest looks like. Instead, this is an attempt only to identify a category of forceful protest which is exempt from the objection that we're going to talk about today. Okay, with all that on the table, let me start with an observation about holding others accountable. So when others behave badly, we often attempt to hold them accountable. And we can distinguish between two ways in which we might try to do this. So the first I'm going to just call persuasion. We might offer the person who's done wrong reasons to see that the thing that they've done is wrong, and try to engage in good faith dialogue in hopes of getting them to see that fact, as well as act differently in the future. So this is an option we're likely to choose when we're dealing with, say, our friends, or maybe our colleagues or our families. Let me try to give some examples. Suppose I lend my friend a book and she carelessly drops it in a puddle. I might try to persuade her to be more careful in the future by arguing that she has reason to take better care of her friend's belongings. Next, suppose I'm on the subway and I see someone with their bag on the seat next to them. Suppose also that this is pre-COVID, before we have the signs that say you're not allowed to sit next to each other. I might take it upon myself in those circumstances to try to persuade the person who has their bag on the seat to take their bag off the seat, because leaving their bag on the seat callously prevents others who might need a seat from sitting. Lastly, suppose I'm at a party and I hear that a friend of mine has been bad-mouthing me behind my back somewhere else in the party. I might go over to them and try to persuade them that since I'm their friend, they ought to speak respectfully about me and not, badmouth me. So I think as these examples already suggest, persuasion is sometimes a kind of strange way of responding to bad conduct. It seems strange to respond to somebody bad-mouthing you by trying to persuade them not to do it. Odds are they already know that they're not supposed to be doing that, and they do it anyways because they get some sort of perverse pleasure out of it. So it might seem there's no point in telling them something they already know and something that they've chosen to disregard. All the same, as I've suggested, persuasion is appealing because it's non-confrontational and respectful. When I try to persuade you not to act badly, I'm appealing to your better nature. I'm not trying to force you to act differently. On the contrary, part of the appearance of respectfulness comes from the fact that persuasion ultimately leaves the decision to alter one's conduct in the hands of the wrongdoer. In attempting to persuade my friend to take better care of other people's belongings, I attempt to have no influence over their conduct other than what might follow from the success of my argument. Okay, so that's the first way of holding others accountable that I want to talk about. The second way is what I call sanctioning. This is, not my word. This comes from other authors who have written on the subject. Sanctioning works by imposing penalties. The idea is that when others do wrong, we might impose penalties on them for that wrongdoing so as to incentivize them to act otherwise. So this is a less common option than persuasion. In ordinary interpersonal relationships, it often seems strange to describe what we're doing as incentivizing or penalizing others, and so it seems strange to talk about it as a form of sanctioning. All the same, I think some examples help to show that this is not an entirely unfamiliar practice. So if I'm having a conversation with somebody who likes to talk over me, I might decide that when they interrupt, I will continue to speak and get louder and louder until they stop. Alternatively, if I'm a parent and I hear that my children are starting to pick up swear words, I might make them deposit a quarter in the swear jar every time they swear. Store owners sometimes try to stop people from loitering or sleeping near their stores by playing classical music or a high whining noise that can only be heard by young people. I think as these examples show, in responding to bad conduct, we're sometimes disinterested in changing the minds of wrongdoers. When a store owner plays a high whining noise near their store, they're not trying to convince teenagers not to loiter. They're simply trying to deter them. They're doing that through imposing some sort of burden on them. And so, unlike persuasion, sanctioning doesn't leave the decision to change one's conduct to the wrongdoer. Instead, the sanctioner attempts to make it so that it is in the best interests of the wrongdoer to do as the sanctioner desires. However, and I think naturally at this point, you might have some questions about this sort of dichotomy I've been setting up. These are not the only two options. Oftentimes, when we talk about holding others accountable, it seems like we're not really talking about persuasion or sanctioning. It seems like we're trying to do something else. So to see this, we can note that each of the previous two options is limited, and I've tried to point out these limitations as I've been talking about them. As we've noted, it often seems strange to engage with wrongdoing through persuasion. Often, it seems that people who are acting badly are not likely to respond well to a dispassionate presentation of reasons for them to act otherwise. It seems in those cases like maybe we need to do something more. The person who puts their bag on the seat next to them in rush hour might not be aware of how inconsiderate their action is, but it's much more likely that they just don't care. So it seems sometimes we need to do more. But it seems equally strange to immediately jump to sanctioning in those circumstances. If you think about the example of the person with their bag on the seat, you might ask, well, how is it even really possible to sanction them for doing that? It's difficult to imagine ways that we might somehow incentivize strangers in momentary interactions to behave otherwise. Sure, maybe if everybody treated somebody badly whenever they put their bag on the seat, then they would eventually pick up on it. But that's not really something that you can individually do to hold someone accountable. Sanctions are a blunt tool and they work best over time. Perhaps you might shriek at the person with the bag on their seat and continue to do so until they removed it, but there's a good chance they might not even know why you're doing that and what you're trying to achieve. It would be a bizarre and ineffective way to behave, I think. So it seems that sometimes persuasion is ineffective, maybe even inappropriate, and it seems like the same is true of sanctioning. Moreover, as I just tried to show with the subway example, it seems like they're sometimes both ineffective and inappropriate in the same sort of cases. In just a moment, I'm going to try to suggest that these sorts of cases actually comprise many of the most important cases that we ought to be concerned about when we talk about holding others accountable. So if we're to avoid taking ineffective and inappropriate actions and holding others accountable, it seems like we need a third option. The third option, which I think has generally been neglected in writing about moral responsibility, offers, to my mind, a more natural response to the sort of wrongdoing and falls somewhere between persuasion and sanctioning. The idea is that sometimes we engage with others in a way that is communicative like persuasion, and yet forceful like sanctioning. This third option, which I'm going to call reproof, works by imposing burdens or hard treatment on others in the same way that sanctioning does. But unlike sanctioning, these burdens are not designed to simply work as incentives to change behavior. Instead, the burdens themselves serve to communicate something. I think the best way to make the suggestion clear is again to consider some examples. So imagine you and I are walking through a forest and you're eating a chocolate bar. You finish the chocolate bar and you just drop the wrapper on the ground. I might turn to you with a shocked expression and say, don't litter. In this sort of commonplace example, I'm not really trying to persuade you. I haven't given you an argument for you not to act otherwise, or for you to act otherwise. Rather, in expressing my shock that you would do such a thing, I am, in a way, imposing a burden on you for your actions. The burden of dealing with your friend or an acquaintance's shocked disapproval. But I'm also not really trying to incentivize you to act differently either. Instead, it seems more plausible to say something like that. I'm trying non-persuasively to get you to respond seriously to the fact that you really shouldn't litter. I'm communicating something to you, even if I'm not trying to persuade you. I think we can also imagine a more extreme example to illustrate the point. So suppose Sam and Pat are in a relationship, and Pat finds out that Sam is cheating on them. In a fit of jealous rage, Pat carves the word cheater into the paint of Sam's car. So here it seems Pat is not trying to persuade Sam. They haven't given Sam an argument, same as in the chocolate bar case. All the same, their actions have a clear communicative purpose that goes beyond incentives. They're trying to hurt their partner, but they're trying to hurt them in a way that says something. Moreover, those actions communicate something that goes beyond what can be communicated persuasively. It's something like an accusation or a condemnation. Okay, so one might reasonably wonder at this point, how is it possible for the burdens imposed by reproof to communicate anything? How is it possible for simply imposing some sort of burden on someone to have any sort of communicative import? I think here it's at least helpful to note that reproof may resemble punishment in at least one respect. So expressive theories of punishment, one of the most famous ones has been articulated by, or one of the most famous exponents of communicative theories or expressive theories of punishment, is Joel Feinberg. And Feinberg argues that punishments are, in his words, conventional symbols of public reprobation. To say this, Feinberg claims, is to say something like champagne is symbolic of celebration, or wearing black is symbolic of mourning. We might add to this list other kinds of conduct that have a kind of conventional social meaning. So knighting ceremonies symbolize an honoring and a recognition of achievement, while heckling a comedian indicates a low opinion of their material. a figure of authority tapping a person on the shoulders with a sword, or an audience member insulting a performer, take on an additional meaning in virtue of social convention that they would not have otherwise. As I've just described it, reproof seems to perform a similar function. In carving cheater into the side of the car, Pat imposes a burden on Sam that has a particular symbolic significance. The damage done to Sam's car helps to express the vehemence and the seriousness of the condemnation. It does something more than persuasion could. Now, a distinctive feature of reproof that emerges out of this comparison is that, unlike persuasion, reproof does not occur within a relation of equality. While good faith persuasion requires entering into a dialogue, something like that, reproof appears non-dialogical in that it's unilateral. Condemnation and accusation, these are not equal kinds of interaction any more than commands or lectures. Reproof then can be described, I think, roughly as a forceful address of reasons to a wrongdoer, or alternatively as reasons expressed non-dialogically through hard treatment or force. Okay, so that's the notion of reproof. I think once we have this idea of reproof before us, we can see that a surprising number of things that we want to describe as holding others accountable resemble reproof, and not persuasion or sanctioning. I'm not going to be able to argue for this claim rigorously here, but it seems like a good amount of demanding, censoring, calling out, canceling, as it were, and so on, are aptly described in terms of reproof. There is a kind of burden at work in these examples, but the burden is itself supposed to say something. It's not just designed to incentivize a change in behavior. For the purposes of this talk, I want to focus on one particular application of the notion of reproof, and that's going to be in the context of political protest. But before we get there, we need to turn to the second step of the argument. So in this step, I want to show that the notion of reproof helps us to solve a tricky problem that theorists writing on the topic of holding others accountable must face. I think a good way to introduce this problem is by looking at a point from P.F. Strawson. So in his famous essay, Freedom and Resentment, maybe infamous, Strawson argues, among other things, that in our relationships with others we view as members of our moral community, we take up a particular sort of attitude. He calls this the participant attitude. It's in virtue of this participant attitude that we're inclined to interpret and respond to the actions of our peers through distinct, what are things that he calls reactive attitudes, like resentment and gratitude, as well as to engage with them by falling in love, getting angry with them, and importantly, by reasoning and negotiating with them. Strawson develops this notion of the participant attitude by opposing it to what he calls objective attitude. We take up the objective attitude towards those we see as somehow excluded from the sphere of ordinary human relationships, those who are temporarily or permanently not fully capacitated in his terminology. We are inclined to interact with these sorts of people who are not fully capacitated, in terms he describes as treatment or training. He thinks that towards these people who are excluded from the sphere of ordinary human relationships, we can feel emotions, but not the rich, complex attitudes we adopt towards our peers. It doesn't make sense to resent them, for instance. We are inclined, as he puts it, to regard them as objects of social policy. So the thought seems to be, we are inclined to react to our fully capacitated moral peers with a range of distinctive attitudes, and to interact with them through a distinctive set of behaviors. Now, I think it's worth noting that Strawson's paper remains controversial, and many reject the idea that reactive attitudes have some sort of important explanatory role for morality. But I don't think we need to sign on to the finer points of Strawson's view to see the pull of the basic idea set out above, that we are inclined to interpret and respond to the actions of others in particular ways when we view them as rational agents, as our peers. In other words, I take the basic point here to be that rational engagement marks a key distinction between our interactions with our fellow rational agents and our interactions with others. By rational engagement here, I'm going to mean simply actions that we take actions we take in the participant attitude are ways of interacting with others that we recognize as rational beings, and in a way that reflects that recognition. So I'm not going to use rational engagement to mean engagement in a way that is rational, but rather engagement in a way that reflects a view of the rationality of the person we're interacting with. Now, the problem that I want to consider for sanctioning emerges, and I've labeled it in the handout, the problem of sanctioning, emerges once we take seriously the idea that our moral practices must be forms of rational engagement. I think the problem is this. Strawson's point is that our interactions with others should be forms of rational engagement, more like falling in love, holding a grudge, and reasoning than like treatment, training, or manipulation. But as we've described it, it's difficult to distinguish sanctioning from training or manipulation. Sanctioning, as we've described it, is simply the brute imposition of incentives in order to get someone to change their behavior. And if that's correct, then theories of holding accountable, which conceive of holding others accountable in terms of sanctioning or in terms of some kind of incentives like that, appear to face a serious problem. A key moral practice is incompatible with the basic terms of moral intercourse. More broadly, I think this is a challenge for theorists who want to acknowledge that holding others accountable often involves treating them harshly. This seems like an appealing intuition, I think. But the most obvious way to talk about the harsh treatment involved in holding others accountable is to speak, as we have, of sanctioning. But if sanctioning is off the table, then we need to think of some other kind of way that hard treatment might be involved in holding others accountable. Now, I think reproof offers a ready solution to this trouble. For, as we've seen, it is communicative in virtue of the hard treatment involved. All the same, it doesn't work through the imposition of incentives. Instead, it communicates something. It addresses the wrongdoer, and that communication is supposed to achieve the desired change in conduct. So reproof, then, doesn't appear to resemble training or manipulation in the same way as sanctioning. It allows us to hang on to the idea that holding others accountable sometimes involves hard treatment without making that hard treatment incompatible with the terms set by the participant attitude. In other words, reproof avoids the comparison to training and manipulation because it says something where sanctioning doesn't. Now, I think another way to argue for this point is to think more carefully about the distinction drawn by the terms of rational engagement. So as Strawson has it, recall, rational engagement marks a distinction between reasoning and negotiation on one hand and training and manipulation on the other. And I think if we could find general terms for the distinction he's trying to draw here, we could argue that reproof is compatible with the participant stance, where sanctioning is not, without just relying on the resemblance between sanctioning and training. But Strawson never expresses the distinction, this distinction in general terms. Instead, he's content to characterize it in terms of examples, as I have largely followed him at doing. So any attempt to be more rigorous here is going to require us to step into the realm of interpretation. All the same, I think we can make some progress here. I want to suggest at least one general principle that allows us to characterize the terms of rational engagement. Reasoning and negotiation seem to be subject to a norm of what I'll call genuineness here, or good faith, whereas it seems like the same is not true of training and manipulation. In reasoning and negotiation, we generally recognize that we ought to be open and honest with one another. Imagine you and I are trying to work through a solution to a disagreement, or think through a problem we face together. Something goes wrong in these cases if I try to lead you to conclusions that I think are false or unfair, or if I'm evasive about my own motivations, if I try to take advantage of you, and so on. It seems in these cases we would say that although appearing to reason and negotiate, I'm not really doing that at all. I'm doing something more insidious. So it seems reasoning and negotiation are deficient if the parties do not enter into them in good faith. To be clear, the point is not just that reasoning might have a false or unjust outcome in these circumstances. The point is that if the parties to a negotiation lack a certain degree of good faith, their interaction ceases to resemble a negotiation at all. Likewise, if I'm evasive, belligerent, or misleading when you attempt to reason with me, we would not say that you had succeeded in reasoning with me, perhaps only that I had refused to listen to reason, or maybe that I could not be reasoned with. Training and treatment, on the other hand, are subject to no such requirements. You don't really need to be genuine with your dog to train them. Indeed, it's not even clear what it would mean to say that you're training your dog in good faith. Maybe that you have their best interests at heart, but that seems like something kind of different than the sort of good faith or genuineness that we're expected to display when it comes to reasoning. Okay. So the point then is that in neither case, neither with training nor with manipulation, is good faith constitutive of the practice that we're talking about. If we take it for granted that rational engagement requires this kind of good faith, then it seems like we can say something like the following. Sanctioning in some cases, in many cases, seems to fall short of the norm of genuineness, for I can sanction you disingenuously by just treating you badly to try and get you to act differently. What matters for an action to count as sanctioning is that it imposes a burden on an alleged wrongdoer in order to effect a change in conduct. But the same isn't true of reproof. If I reprove you disingenuously, then it seems like I've not really reproved you at all. Consider our earlier example. If you litter in the woods and I interject to tell you that you ought not litter, if it turns out that I didn't really think that littering was wrong, or, or if it turned out that I wanted you to stop littering just because I was mad, it would seem like something had gone wrong. Reproof aims at a change in conduct for the reason that the past conduct is wrong. So simply trying to get you to stop littering because you don't want me to yell at you makes my action more like sanctioning than like reproof. Okay, so if all of this is correct, that is, if reproof is subject to the norm of genuineness in a way that sanctioning is not, then we have a further reason to count reproof as a form of rational engagement and to disqualify sanctioning. Okay, so how does all of this help us think about political protest? I've been talking now for 25 minutes and we've spent relatively little time talking about protest. Well, my contention is that the main argument raised by theorists of civil disobedience against the use of force of protest looks remarkably similar to the objection we've just spent so much time talking about. The problem for sanctioning was that it attempts to bring about changes in conduct through the use of incentives without regard for the reasons of the wrongdoer. Likewise, the problem raised against forceful protest is that it attempts to directly and coercively bring about its desired political outcomes rather than participate in the democratic process. Now, we showed that reproof avoids the problem of sanctioning because it is essentially communicative and does not work through the brute use of incentives. My response to the problem facing forceful protest will be analogous. Forceful protest is not always undemocratic because it does not attempt to override the democratic process. And as in the case of the problem of sanctioning, the key here is going to be the notion of reproof. Okay, let's try to make matters more concrete. So let me say something about what I've called up to this point, forceful protest. Now, the use of force in protest is a vexed topic in the literature on civil disobedience, a literature in which much of the philosophical work on protest has been done. Part of the difficulty is that the terms force, coercion, and violence are often used interchangeably and are barely defined. Theorists often slip between them and don't give any justification for doing so. Another reason is that authors frame their accounts of civil disobedience in very different terms. As a result, while they commonly are wary about the use of force, they have some sort of resistance to the use of force in protest. The reasons that they give for being wary about force are not very easy to compare. All the same, I think that there appears to be a sort of consensus among these authors on the topic of force. One account of this consensus, set out by authors like Alexander Livingston, is that people like Rawls, Dworkin, and so on categorically reject the use of force because it's undemocratic. But as I argue elsewhere, I think that's not quite right. Instead, Rawls, Dworkin, and others offer only a qualified rejection of the use of force in protest based on a particular conception of democratic political participation. The basic idea is this: the norms of democratic political participation require that our political engagement acts as an input to the democratic process rather than an attempt to override it. Therefore, forceful protest which attempts to override the democratic process is problematic as a form of political engagement. It's for this reason that Dworkin thinks there's a problem with non-persuasive protest that does not show fidelity to majority rule. Singer raises objections to the use of force on the grounds that it rejects the fair compromise of democracy, and Rawls and Lefkowitz reject the use of force on the grounds that it is incompatible with the requirements of public communication. Force in these cases is problematic when it attempts to directly bring about a desired political outcome rather than make a contribution to the democratic decision-making process. And that's because it oversteps the bounds of democratic political participation. Chiefly, it does not respect the equal right of democratic citizens to have an equal say in decision-making. Okay, so how does the notion of reproof help with all of this? Well, as I've just suggested, the objection that is typically raised against forceful protest in general is in fact an objection to a particular kind of forceful protest. That is, it's an objection to forceful protest that attempts to directly bring about a political outcome. Of course, in some cases, authors seem to think that it's always the case that forceful protest attempts to do this. But I think that that point's generally undefended. So if we can show that this is not the case for all forceful protest, that it's not the case for all forceful protest, that it attempts to override the democratic process, then we will have shown that not all forceful protest is open to this kind of democratic objection. My suggestion is that interpreting forceful protest as a form of reproof fits the bill. So recall that the problem with forceful protest is supposed to be that it attempts to override the democratic process. In this respect, it strongly resembles the one that we just considered facing sanctioning. Namely, sanctioning is problematic because it resembles training and manipulation more than it does reasoning or negotiation. But reproof offered a way out there. Reproof offered an example of holding others accountable that involves harsh treatment and yet is essentially communicative, and so resembles reasoning and negotiation more than training or manipulation. Here, I think reproof performs a similar function. Protest interpreted as a form of reproof involves harsh treatment. In this respect, it seems plausible to say it is often forceful. Moreover, as our earlier discussion shows, it need not attempt to directly bring about its desired outcome, but instead counts as a form of rational engagement that aims at moral change. In short, it's a way of communicating non-persuasively with people in a way that nevertheless aims at a change in their conduct. Moreover, if what I said earlier is correct, then protest as a form of reproof may be a form of rational engagement. So insofar as an important requirement of democratic decision-making is respect for others as our democratic equals, we can make a strong case for the compatibility of forceful protest as reproof with democratic decision-making. Forceful protest, then, need not always attempt to override the democratic process, for, interpreted as a form of reproof, it may instead be a kind of contribution to it. To see how this argument works out in practice, I think we can consider a final example. So imagine a city has a mayor who, in the last election, pledged to increase funding for social services, but since then has only increased police funding and has led multiple crackdowns on the city's homeless population. Just imagine for a moment. After a particularly brutal series of police interventions, citizens of the city stage a protest. They surround City Hall, they block its entrances, and they lead chants calling for the mayor to resign. Now, this seems like a fairly uncontroversial example of forceful protest. It seems like many people would be inclined to call it that because it's directly blocking people from doing their jobs. All the same, the protest here also appears to be an example of reproof. It responds to a clear wrongdoing. It appears to make sense to make use of some hard treatment in that it denies the mayor as well as other city employees entrance to City Hall. And this harsh treatment sends a clear message. The blocking of City Hall helps to communicate a condemnation of the mayor's behavior. If what I've said about reproof is true, then it seems that the protest avoids the problem of forceful protest, for it's not an attempt to coerce a particular outcome, but is instead plausibly a kind of democratic contribution. It is saying something in such a way as to contribute to the democratic decision-making process. So the main conclusion of this argument is that thinking about forceful protest as a form of reproof allows us to disarm, or at least weaken, an important challenge raised to forceful protest. This is because reproof is communicative, and more than that, appears to be communicative in a way that is consistent with rational engagement. Before I conclude by considering some upshots of this argument, let me briefly summarize the argument that I made throughout this paper. So I began by distinguishing reproof from persuasion and sanctioning as forms of holding others accountable. I then presented what I called the problem of sanctioning, that sanctioning resembles training and manipulation more than reasoning or negotiation, and so falls short of the participant stance and the rational engagement required by it. I showed that reproof avoids this problem despite its resemblance to sanctioning, because reproof says something in a way that sanctioning doesn't. It therefore plausibly counts as rational engagement and is consistent with the participant attitude. Then I turned to discuss forceful protest. Forceful protest, I showed, faces a similar problem to the one faced by sanctioning, that forceful protest tries to override rather than contribute to the democratic process. And I suggested that the notion of reproof allows us to say that this isn't the case. For reproof offers an example of a use of force which is itself communicative, not coercive. Moreover, as our earlier discussion showed, has a plausible claim to being a form of rational engagement, which appears to make it consistent with a rational decision-making process. Now, for the sake of clarity, I've largely talked throughout this talk about protest in highly abstract terms. And the idea has been to engage with the sort of objections that we have on our hands in their own terms, which is to say in highly abstract terms, and sketch out a conceptual gap that has been left open. I haven't yet made the argument that any particular acts of protest should be interpreted in this light, however. In the last few minutes of this talk, let me try to say a little bit about why I think this is a helpful point to make in thinking about actual instances of protest. So discussions of protest in popular media like newspapers, television, social media, and so on, often place a high premium on protest being peaceful. This is also true in philosophy. As we've seen, it seems like the authors writing about forceful protests seem worried about the use of force and seem to almost reject it categorically. There's a temptation when speaking of protests that has ceased to be peaceful to think that all bets are off. You know, in resorting to the use of force, protesters have given up on trying to persuade anyone. They've given up on trying to change anyone's mind. They've given up on politics as usual, and they declare themselves beyond the reach of reason. Accordingly, when protest becomes violent, when looting starts, when buildings are burned, it can seem difficult to interpret such uses of force as anything but attempts to force others to behave as protesters want. But as the arguments I've just tried to make show, not all uses of force are forcing others to act as we wish. Instead, sometimes uses of force are attempts to communicate. It shows us that sometimes force itself has something to say. Sometimes force itself can express a condemnation and can call for change. The appeal of this view becomes clear once we consider how this sort of analysis might apply to some recent cases. So consider, for instance, a recent example. So the 2020 protests in Minneapolis over the murder of George Floyd. As was widely reported there, these protests included both traditional forms of peaceful protest. There were, marches and demonstrations, but there were also violent and disruptive forms of protest, such as vandalism, arson, blockades. I think the most visible use of force in these protests was the dramatic burning of the police precinct home to the officers who killed Floyd. But if protest here is interpreted as a form of reproof, we don't have to just see these sorts of forceful, even destructive actions as meaningless or as attempts to impose, to incentivize others to act as we wish. Instead, we can say that something like the burning of Minneapolis PD's 3rd precinct isn't just a random act of violence. Instead, it's an expression of condemnation. And that condemnation is itself linked to the injustice of Floyd's murder. I think it's plausible to say something similar about many cases of police violence, at least about some of the uses of force that attend them. But I think the point applies in other contexts too. So, more recently in November 2021, there were protests in downtown Toronto against TC Energy, which is the company responsible for the Coastal GasLink pipeline, now in construction through Wet'suwet'en territory. But in a November 2021 action, protesters marched into the lobby of a building that TC Energy was associated with and presented them with a symbolic notice of trespass. It's a poster-sized document alleging the trespass of CGL construction on Wet'suwet'en territory. So there again, reproof seems to be an apt frame of analysis. There's a clear pointing to an injustice and a calling out for change. And there's some sort of use of force involved in this too, the occupation of a building, the chanting of the chanting of the office workers out of their office. But all the same, that's intended to communicate something, and we see what it's intended to communicate in the giant document that they tried to hand them over. So I conclude, the notion of reproof offers us, I think, a powerful tool for navigating debates over the use of force in the philosophical literature on protest. For it helps us to distinguish the issue of force as a means of protest from the different sorts of ends that force can be put to. And to the extent that the end of forceful protest is a kind of communication consistent with democratic political participation, it seems clear that forceful protests need not always be undemocratic. Thank you. That's my talk.
Oh, I was on mute. Thank you so much, Henry. I am going to pause the recording now.